Boardroom Bound, episode 103. What she did that built her career as a CEO with Jen Wolfe.
You know, that's such an interesting story, and it's not surprising at all, because what you're basically saying is they chose the person who was probably most like them, and that when you say cultural fit, it means that's going to be comfortable. He or she's probably going to agree with us most of the time. Really what boards need right now is somebody who's going to challenge their thinking, who might not agree with them all the time.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we are speaking with Jen Wolfe, and she is one of the leading experts on all things that are disruptive into the boardroom along the lines of digital and cyber and future trends, the stuff that just seems to be changing the pace so quickly that we all need to keep on track of. And the best thing, she will break it down for us in non-jargon. She will use normal human being speak. And she's just released a book on this, which just tells you how much she knows about it. She trains boards on this stuff regularly. She's got great insights for us today. Let's jump into the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you today.
Well, I am thrilled to have you on this show because I would be very honest and say when I get feedback from our listeners, one of the topics we have not done justice to thus far is clearly all of the stuff that's changing so much, and it's so complex for many people, from the cyber to the digital, all of those sort of buckets of things. You are an expert in these topics. You teach on these topics to so many people in the board space that there's a wonderful place for to have you on the show today and ask us some of the questions and break it down so we can start to be a little bit more knowledgeable about it.
Well, great. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
And before we get there, let's just set it up a little bit of background and experience so our audience understands how you wrapped your head around all these complex subjects.
So my career started a little over 20 years ago when I graduated from law school from the University of Cincinnati. And I actually, at the age of 28, started my own law firm. And over the course of a 10-year cycle, I grew it into the largest woman-owned intellectual property law firm in the country, doing business with both Fortune 500 companies and managing patent portfolios and intellectual property portfolios, as well as working heavily in the startup and venture capital community. So that experience from both running a business, serving as a lawyer and an advisor in these highly technical and changing areas really set the foundation for me. And then in 2012, I started a consultancy, an advisory firm, to work with C-suite executives and ultimately boards to understand how these technologies are driving trends, what the risks and opportunities are, and things they should be thinking about going forward. And through that process, I started writing books. I've actually written my fifth book now, which is Disruption in the Boardroom, and I think that's how we came to be talking today.
That's right. And that is not the first boardroom book you've written. So of your five, I mean, I would say just from the titles alone, it's very obvious that three of them are ones that we should be reading. So maybe you can maybe we can start by differentiating some of the topics that you're covering between the three of those, and we'll do a deeper dive into what you've got going on right now.
Absolutely. So my first boardroom focus book was back in 2016. I wrote a book entitled Digital in the Boardroom. And it's really because as I started interacting with more people on boards and learning about some of the challenges they were facing, I realized they really needed just a handbook, a guide, something very practical and not technical to help them understand some of these new trends. So I started back then looking at things like social media and cybersecurity, understanding how to incorporate new technologies into the boardroom. And then a couple years later, the topic of blockchain was just booming. It was coming up in a lot of conferences I went to, targeted to boards, and I realized they weren't understanding what this technology was. It was being very misconstrued as it related to cryptocurrency. And so, again, I set out to do some research and write a book that was more of a handbook in the boardroom to understand why blockchain was important outside the financial sector and what might come of that. And then this latest one, entitled Disruption in the Boardroom, is really like it sounds. The boardroom is being totally disrupted now, from things like cybersecurity, of course, that's been going on, but also these new environmental, social issues, issues related to total disruption of business models. And obviously with what we've gone through this year with COVID, understanding that everything could change and boards have to be prepared to adapt into future needs. So disruption in the boardroom is really focused on how do you get the right people at the table and have perhaps a new structure to the board to be prepared for some of these disruptive changes.
And that is something that maybe parallels with stuff we're seeing going on in society, right? So not that these are necessarily related, but we have seen a big movement over the last 10 years or so for more diversity in the boardroom, right? And some people can picture that by gender, and people are also saying, well, we need different people of different backgrounds, whether they are global or minority status, socioeconomic, whatever it might be. And I imagine that ties in a little bit, clearly not the same thing, but when we look at the boardroom, what we need to change, COVID is also forcing boards to say, okay, we're not all traveling to get together at the same pace. How do we adjust and do what we're doing? I imagine in some ways it almost feels like a perfect storm for you to have this platform to help people figure out how they come up with the right structure for the boards. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think when we start talking about diversity in the boardroom, it certainly, we can check sort of those typical diversity boxes of race and gender and so on, but it's really diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. And, when I talk to recruiters, what they're saying is this is really a serious problem in the boardroom because despite the reality that CEOs and boards know they need to have more diversity of thought, meaning people coming from different backgrounds in their boardroom, they continue to kind of hire the same person. They continue to look for somebody who was a CEO or a CFO of a similarly sized company. And while those people are certainly qualified, what it means is if you keep putting those same people around the table, you're not getting diversity of thought. Right. And so while issues of cybersecurity and technology are claimed to be some of the most important issues for companies, only 2% of board seats are filled with people with that expertise. And that to me really says it all.
And when I think about it, if you go back to the old days, 20, 30 years ago, you were a sitting or maybe a retired CEO. That's how you're qualified. Then they diversified by adding CFOs, sitting or retired CFOs. And now you get to the point, people might say all of the C-suite. And I would argue you definitely want maybe one or two CEOs of similar sized companies. That's incredibly important. But those other seats, and there aren't very many around the table, you need to be able to cover things like cyber and digital. We could talk about lots of stuff. Maybe chief HR officers are becoming super important after COVID. People realized, how do we manage the workforce? But help us understand. So imagine you've got a boardroom of people that have been there for a long time. It's a very seasoned group of individuals. Maybe none are experts in cyber, tech, all of this sort of stuff. How do you go about coaching them through the process of realizing, hey, in your next hire, as you're going through your competency matrix, you've got to prioritize this one? Because they'd probably go, but there's 5 things we have to prioritize.
That's right. And what's really hard is board seats don't turn over that frequently. I mean, you're really waiting for somebody to retire or sometimes for them to die to have a seat open up. And I know that sounds funny. It does. But I mean, we see board members staying into their 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. And, so I think that the CEO and the lead director really have to work together to do a board assessment or an evaluation or a review or something to help the board realize when they don't have the right number or the right types of people at the table. And part of that could be saying, do we need to add some board seats so we bring that into the room? Or do we need to create an advisory board to help us address some of these issues? But it's really a tough one because people don't like to give up those board seats. They're hard to get. Mm-hmm. In some cases, they can be fairly lucrative for the board member, and so they don't want to give those up. And that becomes a real challenge, and that's where there has to be some leadership within the organization and within the board itself to say, we have to identify when we don't have the right skill set and start bringing some people in with some different skills.
And I'm going to let you make a pitch here in a second, but I will give an analogy. A friend of mine landed her first public company board seat. She was very excited. And when it became official, she was able to tell the story about the interview process. They brought 3 finalists before COVID happened. It was a public company, so it took a long time to actually happen. Mm-hmm. They had to go through the voting. But she said they brought 3 finalists in, and they were 3 very different people. So there was a chief HR officer type, there was a digital type, and there was a sort of legally financy expert type. The board had decided all 3 of these were critical hires, but they only had a single seat open. And they decided they were all, if you can think of it this way, equally qualified candidates. They would love to have all of them. And they decided cultural fit would trump the day. So whichever was the best of them, cultural fit was the one they were going to go with. And the next 2, they would just have, we're going to keep these open for the next slot in terms of the type of person that we're looking to go for. And so you probably can understand why that is a fit. Like cultural fit is so important to so many boards. But I'd love if you could make the case for boards listening going, okay, but maybe this is the thing that we need the most. It trumps the other stuff, because if we don't have someone who understands the digital, the cyber, that sort of stuff, help our audience understand. You've got to break it down a bit into simple terms, how we can wrap our heads around this. Imagine we're in a boardroom with nobody who gets it at all.
That's such an interesting story, and it's not surprising at all, because what you're basically saying is they chose the person who was probably most like them. And that when you say cultural fit, it means that's going to be comfortable.
Right.
He or she's probably going to agree with us most of the time. Really what boards need right now is somebody who's going to challenge their thinking, who might not agree with them all the time. That's really what we need now more than ever. When we get into sort of a group think mode in the boardroom, that's a real danger sign, because boards are there to provide oversight. They're not there to manage the company. They're there to provide oversight of the management team. And if everybody thinks the same way, if everybody is a quote-unquote cultural fit, then you're not going to have any you're not going to have the robust conversation and the dissonance that you really do need. We do need a little bit of dissonance to make sure that we're thinking clearly. And it's a hard one. I mean, I'm not going to lie. That's a really hard one to get a board to accept. But I think true leaders have that moral courage to understand that they need people who are intellectually curious, and they need people who are going to be willing to stand up and ask tough questions of management, because otherwise they're really not performing the function that they are there to perform.
And Jen, I think it's easy sometimes for someone on the outside to be able to say, we know you need that diversity of thought. It's probably hard to innovate if everyone is, say, pale, male, and stale, if we all look and sound alike, or it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when we step back, you made a comment before, you're talking about advisory boards, right? So we talked about the boardroom is, let's say, full around the table. No one wants to give up their seat. Well, we can sort of rent or hire these experts as needed, put them on the advisory board rather than having them on the real board. What are your thoughts on that and the value it does or does not bring to an organization if someone's only on the advisory board?
I think it can be incredibly helpful, and I think that that's a trend that we're going to see, because boards realize the deficiencies they have, but as we've just been discussing, they don't want to give up their seat. So a next step, an easier step, is to say, I'm going to hire some advisors to work with us. So if you have cyber and technology embedded in your risk committee or perhaps your governance committee, to look externally and say, let's put together a board of people who will advise us, or some paid consultants who will come in and give us the information that we need. I think that's a good next step. If you're not ready to add some board seats or to replace the board seats, I think that's a way to at least take a step in the right direction. However, I will say that if you're going to do that, I think it's important that you don't just hire the company law firm to do something like that. You've really got to get independent advice and perspective so that you as the board are getting the advice for you as the board, not for the company. Because those are two different things from a fiduciary standpoint.
Absolutely true. And you are called upon to do these sorts of things. So you will be brought in to consult with boards, facilitate discussions, to have the retreats, to give the keynote speeches. And I think this is fascinating. And I don't know if you can teach us how you do this, but the idea that you are improving the ability for the board to map what lies ahead and prepare for the future trends and digital opportunities and threats. That is a really cool sentence, but that sounds almost impossible, especially with the stuff that we're seeing going on in the world today.
It is, and that's why you have to break it down into smaller pieces. Like anything that's complex, it can sound overwhelming. And so part of what I do and the workshops that I facilitate is break it down into these smaller pieces of, the various risks that we might have in terms of cybersecurity, and start asking questions. And what I find is really it is about asking questions. It's about sitting down with the board and the management team and asking some really tough questions so that the board can start to understand where their risks and opportunities are in each of these areas. And even when it comes to future trends, it's really about taking people around this cycle of, okay, here are the top 10 technological shifts that are going to impact businesses. Let's talk through each one of them. And it's painful because you have to spend a lot of time and you have to have these difficult conversations. But I find when boards are willing to invest that half a day or a day in having these conversations and asking these questions and realizing where they might not have all the information they need, it's really helpful. And I've even seen times where we've done it with the board and the management team, and the management team had no idea that the board didn't know what they were doing. They had no idea. And so we helped sort of connect those dots that for whatever reason were not being connected in the way things had been done previously.
It's interesting, right? If you're a board member, and let's say you have a portfolio of boards where you're meeting, let's pretend it's the old days and you're showing up every quarter for the meeting. Obviously, there's stuff in between, but you're trying to keep your finger on the pulse, but you're not management. You're not seeing it day to day, and trying to know and remember those details is not so easy. But, Jen, let's use one example of something that's going on today that I think more and more boards are probably exponentially getting worried about would be ransomware and an understanding of like what that looks and feels like. And I would extrapolate what you just said and say, I was an athlete growing up, right? So the more you practice and the better you do that, the better you'll be in the game. So if you're a board, if you can think about these sort of risky scenarios in advance, even if you don't have all the answers, you'll be better prepared to deal with it. And ransomware is scary because they could, not only just for public company boards, but think about our government entities and utilities and things like that. That is something that's so topical and so live. Would love your thoughts on this, including how organizations can be prepared.
Yes, you are right. Ransomware is, I think, a very real threat to every organization. It is on the rise, and we don't really even know how many times it happens because many times a hospital will have ransomware. They don't want everybody knowing that the hospital was hit with a ransomware attack. So many times they might pay it, and you just it never gets reported. You never even hear about it. I know when I've heard people from the FBI talk, they say this is one of the biggest concerns that they have, and the investment that they have in cybersecurity has dramatically increased in recent years. So doing the tabletop exercise, okay, what if this happens? What if that happens? It's really, really critical. I mean, we expect our boards to be prepared to answer those questions. What if we are hit with ransomware? What if this is the situation? What if we have something running through our organization that's fundamentally shutting down all of our systems? How are we going to react? How are we as a board going to come together? These are really important crisis communication preparedness tools that really is just about asking those what if scenarios and then ensuring that you have the protocols and the procedures in place to respond.
And let's also be very cognizant for our audience that there's a difference between, so I worked at JP Morgan in my prior role, or Amazon, the largest organizations with the biggest budgets that maybe are higher profile targets, but you're talking about a local hospital or smaller organizations that may not have the resources, but might even be a better target because they're paying less attention and there might be a backdoor that someone has missed. All organizations need to think about this, but JP Morgan, for example, spends $250 million a year. They built 3 state-of-the-art follow-the-sun centers in New York, Hong Kong, and London, have staff 24/7 that are always focused on this, are always being penetrated and probed. Organizations are looking to exploit them. But this is not the only company out there that needs to focus on this. I guess everybody does. But Jen, you're advising companies in all sorts of spectrums in their ability to handle this sort of stuff. How do you help organizations figure out the right game plan for them?
Yeah, so it's an excellent point that you made. Obviously, yes, some of the really big financial institutions, energy companies, transportation companies, those are all sort of obvious targets, and they have the budgets, as you just indicated. But it's equally important for smaller companies and smaller organizations to be thinking about this because, the quote-unquote bad guys out there, when they come at you with a ransomware, they're going to price it knowing where your sweet spot is. They're not going to ask you for more money than you can pay. They're going to ask you for just that amount that it's going to be painful if you don't give into it.
And they're really honest.
Really
they're
important.
Nice guys. If you pay them off, they'll unlock it. That's because their business model works, right? You got to be able to trust them.
It does work. It does work. It absolutely does. I mean, and so I obviously come from an IP background. We talked about patent trolls for many, many years,
right.
And that's what I always said. They're going to attack your company right at the sweet spot. If you're a smaller company, it might be $100,000 because that would be cheaper than trying to defend yourself. If you're a big company, it's going to be in the millions of dollars. And these bad actors out there, they do the exact same thing. They know where to price it so that they're likely to get you to pay. And so that's why it's so important that when you do your practice session, you do your tabletop, that you make it real, make it real for you. And you don't have to go spend a lot of money on consultants. These are things that if you don't have the budgets for it, you just have to take the time to say, let's have the conversation. Let's write out a process. Let's make sure we know how we would react and make it tough on us. Make it a tough conversation.
Now, I think we can all resonate with the idea of ransomware, and it's going to make a big difference. There were stories that have come out about during COVID, how some of the bad actors were saying, we won't hit your hospitals now, but we know it'll come later, right? So when things settle back down.
Right.
But we also have a sense that that's something we can wrap our heads around. Like, that's a terrible situation. But digital, the disruption changes things on paradigms that most people probably haven't thought about. So, for example, I imagine you're helping boards wrestle with the future of, say, work and privacy, which is an amorphous thing. How do you help organizations come through something like that?
Well, so that absolutely is a big one. And a big piece of it is really identifying what are the big, mega trends that we're watching. And there's all sorts of different sources for that. But really helping companies think through this. Okay, we've got artificial intelligence. We've got robotics and the Internet of Things. We have smart everything. We have now a changing workforce that's going to be working remotely, whether they're at home or in a hotel room or somewhere else. What does that mean for us? We've seen issues even with Zoom when it first started that people were getting hacked. Are we on a confidential line? How can I be confident that all of these files going back and forth and up to the cloud are secure? There's a whole host of issues that have to be addressed. But I think part of it is really getting the board all on the same page about what are the big macro trends that are going to impact our business, because there's opportunities and there's risks in every single one of them, and you want to be looking at both of those things as you start to address it. So again, it's taking these big, massive, complex issues and breaking them down into smaller chunks to have meaningful conversations about it so that you're prepared. Because if you haven't even thought about them, you really can't make smart decisions, and you surely cannot oversee when you have, your chief marketing person coming in and talking to you, or your chief HR person coming in and talking to you. If you haven't spent your own time intellectually doing the work to know what the questions are, you're not going to ask the right questions. You're just going to be nodding your head, and then you're not doing your job in terms of oversight.
Right. Now, Jen, we talked a little bit before that there's a big distinction between management and the people in the boardroom. And I think anyone listening to this show is accomplished at being the executive side, about doing things, rolling up the sleeves and leading the team. And the first time you land over in the board side, it's a real shock to the system in many ways. And one of those is adjusting to the nose in, fingers out approach. And I would love if you give some sort of examples or ideas about how you've been working with boards. And you talk about sometimes it's boards with management working together, perhaps in war game scenarios. How can a board member, so some of our audience are aspiring board members, some are brand new board members, all trying to think, how do I do this well? How do they help management without stepping on their toes? What's the right way to do this? I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, when the board was having their discussion days, if you ask, say, 3 questions of management, they'd be like, whoa, I think you guys are starting to cross the line here into our space. That's not the same way today. But how do you see organizations that do it best?
So I think that you're exactly right. It used to be don't ask all these questions. But really, if there's one job of a board member, it is to ask questions. There's a theory. I've got a black belt in Six Sigma and have studied processes for a long time. And there's a rule called the 5 why approach, which is if you keep asking the why question 5 times, you'll get to the root cause of the problem. I tell board members this all the time. If somebody tells you something from management, ask them why, and then ask them why again, and ask them why 5 times, so that you're getting to the root cause of either the problem or why they think what they think, because your job is to make sure that their thinking is right. I mean, that really is the job of a board member now, is to make sure that the management team is clearly seeing where the risks are and where the strategy needs to go. It's not to have the strategy or provide the strategy or to come in and solve all the problems. It is to make sure they are doing that so you're protecting shareholders, stakeholders, employees, everyone who has something at stake. That's your role. So being the chief questioner is really probably one of the most important skills that you have coming into the boardroom.
And let's bring this back to something we were talking at the beginning of the discussion of why it's so important to have, let's call it the cyber digital person sitting in the room who can ask those questions. Because if there's no one on the board who gets the presentation that's coming up, they can't really give that pushback and thought and say, I've seen that, but I wondered, have you thought about what has happened over here? Have you any stories about how that's played out really well for organizations?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, that's when we go back to where we were talking earlier, that diversity of thought. Unless you're going to really go out and do your homework, you're not going to know what questions to ask. And I will say, I know a lot of board members who were, a former CEO or CFO, but they go out and read and they study and they learn so that they can come prepared to ask these questions. So, I don't think that just because you were in a role that wasn't technical that you can't become technical or that you can't learn, but it takes some real discipline. And so I think that's where boards and directors have to be focused on how are they going to learn what they don't know. And be ready to admit that they might not know everything that they need to know. I think that's a big piece of it as well. You get to the boardroom, if you've gotten to that point, you've obviously had an accomplished career, you're highly educated, so you feel like you know a lot, and you have wisdom, which is why you're being put in that seat. But we're all in a state of continual learning. We have to be, because things keep changing. I mentioned I wrote a book on blockchain. That was a couple years ago. Guess what? Some of that might be outdated because things keep changing. So we all have to have this discipline for continuous learning, but particularly in the boardroom when your role is to question what you're being told.
If only we knew some good books about disruption in the boardroom or digital in the boardroom or things like that. But we do, which is great. But I kid, but I agree with you. So a board member's job is you are always learning. I think that's the fun part, right? So you want a job where you're a 50-50. You bring value immediately, but there's opportunities for you to learn and grow. And I think about board members' bedside table. There's probably 3 to 4 books on there. Maybe there's some autobiography about someone that they're learning from, about some new technical skill they want to bring to the room, or maybe someone who'd been a seasoned person and was successful doing blah, blah, blah. I imagine that's true as a goal for all of us. I think that's part of the fun. And I imagine it's also a part of it. We're all trying to probably look forward and think about future trends as well, as much as we can. And that's a skill that some people have more than others. And I know that's one that you bring. So we have all been living through a massive period of disruption that no one saw coming, and it's been changing of so much good and bad in different ways. And I'm sure people are coming to you going, okay, Jen, future trend me, what's coming up? What do I got to worry about? What do I think about? How do I get ready?
I think some of the big trends that are coming up is an acceleration of the use of artificial intelligence and robotics. Because of all of this, people are going to want to be doing more things remotely. Virtual reality, augmented reality, these are some of the things that I see really are going to be pushed because we're going to need it. I mean, and I think we are now more willing to accept a shift in operating in a more virtual manner. So there are some of these big shifts that are going to come pretty quickly. And I think companies really need to understand what that means, and then what the ethical questions are, particularly in the artificial intelligence realm. When you start to push in all of this AI into what you're doing, you're entrusting that to the computer, to the technology, instead of a human to make decisions and to have judgment. And so I think there's a lot of ethical questions that directors need to start thinking about, because it's already embedded into so many of the things that we use and probably most of the software that companies are using. So I think for board members to really be thinking about, okay, how are these trends going to impact us operationally, our employees? How's it going to impact how we evaluate our employees? I'll give an example there with the AI, and there's lots of other trends as well. That was just one of the ones I picked up on. But it was, I believe it was Amazon was using some artificial intelligence to try to recruit people. And it found that it was biased against women because of the data sets that were going in on who had been successful before had been primarily men. And they realized that there was a bias in the AI that it was not intended. They weren't doing it on purpose. So they had to pull back from using it. And so we have this big danger that as AI, which is continuously learning based upon data sets that it comes into contact with, if there's bias going into that, we're going to get bias coming out. And so there's just a lot of issues that we have to look at in terms of, what do we think is the right thing to do as we're rolling out some of this AI, and how are we looking for those unintended consequences?
Garbage in, garbage out. You're right. It's how we prepare the tools to be helpful for us and to move in the right direction. And there's no question that the pace is changing. And I think when I talk to some board members, they're very excited about that, seeing how they have the rules about what they had to do and where they had to be in person so often. But now they have a technology they can meet more regularly, so they can stay on top of things. The schedule change has allowed them to be more flexible with the other stuff they've got going on. We've seen some positives coming out of this. And I wonder if we talked a little bit about this before, about the diversity of thought in the boardroom, your perspective on the trends we're starting to see. So, for example, when California first passed the law about diversity in the boardroom, adding women was a great idea, but what we saw was the vast majority were Caucasian. And so they have the second law that's coming into place. Well, we also meant minorities too. And you think about the statistics where 40% of California is Latino, but the board membership in California was 0.4% Latino, which did not represent what they wanted it to. So I think that's similar to the AI. Like, we tell something to happen, but if we don't give it the right information, it won't necessarily do the right output. And for a board member to think about, okay, I only know the information to some extent that management gives me and that I ask for. And there's so much going on in a massive organization like an Amazon. A board probably would never know about that going into it. How can board members be doing the best they can to make sure the organization are making the right decisions they can?
So, that really all comes down to I think the incentives that you have for your executives. And you're right, at a company the size of Amazon or some of these very large, Fortune 10, Fortune 100 companies, you're not going to necessarily know all the little nuances of what's going on down inside the organization, but you can know what incentives you've put in place for your senior leadership team. So are you incenting them to look for unintended consequences? Are you incenting them to root those things out? Are you incenting them to create a culture of inclusion? Are you incenting them to look for new sources of information and new trends and be able to respond quickly to them? And that's what I find in most organizations is if the incentives are all about complete this task or hit these numbers, complete this roadmap, if that's how your senior leadership team is financially incented, that is what they are going to be laser focused on, is how do I accomplish that? Because that's how I get my bonus, that's how I get ahead. If you don't have in that incentive structure some of these other things that we're talking about, they're not going to do that. So I think if you talk about in the boardroom, what can you do to make sure that's happening? Make sure the incentives are right for your senior leadership team, because that should then trickle down through the organization.
That makes so much sense. And Jen, we have covered so much today, but I know that all of our audience is able to leave with more knowledge about digital and cyber and all this stuff that's changing so fast, and great resources to learn more about it. I heard there's a new book out there that's really exciting. So we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Jen Wolfe. She is someone who takes these complex subjects like digital disruption and cybersecurity, the future of work and privacy, and just explained it to us in ways that we could all understand, which is so important because everybody in the boardroom needs to know at least a little about this, if not a lot. We all want to learn and grow and develop, so I highly recommend her new book. Great way to get up to speed very quickly. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about today, including Jen's new book. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.